way out? It was hard not to stare at the scars. I've seen suicide attempts before, but none like his. The scars ran right from the wrist, all along his lower arm, on the inside of the elbow, up through the inner side of his upper arm. They seemed to stare at me, with their dark red color, contrasted by the pale skin and the black of the string that saved his life. These were the arms of a man that didn't want to try to die. He wanted to make sure that he would be dead. And yet he was alive, maybe because the cuts weren't so deep, because the scissors had been too dull. Archer, I said his name carefully, as if my words could destroy him more. Why did you do that to yourself? He smiled back at me, grinning while I asked why he killed himself, without even a hint of irony. Because I couldn't take it anymore. Because I didn't want the pain anymore. Because I had forgotten what it was like to live without pain. For a young man that had tried to kill himself a few weeks earlier, he was far too happy. I don't even remember how it started. I was just normal, doing sports, meeting friends, and finishing school. But then, this thing came and I kept waking up in the same way every day. Archer was clenching his fists, dangerously stretching the string that was holding his life together. It must have been half a year ago, or maybe even a year. It was so hard to keep track. I remember it was a Thursday, definitely a Thursday, but I'm not even sure which month. I think the first time I just woke up normally, like I always used to. I rolled over, hit the snooze button, and slept for another 5 minutes. I always did that at least twice. When I finally managed to get out of bed, I stumbled out of my room into the bathroom, and that's when I heard the noise. Even as he was talking, I could see the fear in his face. It sounded like a crash, like something breaking. I heard my family screaming, so I grabbed my towel and ran downstairs. But they just didn't stop screaming, and there were loud banging noises. I nearly tripped when I was half down the stairs, when I saw the man raising the axe, and then the axe cutting through my brother's neck. I heard Jonathan scream, and then it suddenly stopped. It just stopped, and his head rolled over to the side. And then, said Archer, he turned to me. Archer looked towards his feet. I was frozen from fear. I mean, there was a guy that just killed my brother, and I think Jonathan's head was still moving, and he had turned to me. I recovered when he was getting on the stairs, and I was making my first step. But then I already felt the pain in my leg. I can't even describe how much that hurt. And it didn't stop there. I fell on the stairs, heard my mom scream from somewhere downstairs, and then he smashed the axe right in my chest. Archer held his hands toward his heart. I heard my own ribs crack. So, you are telling me you died? He shook his head. Then he nodded. I thought I died. But then I heard my alarm ring and woke up. This time I didn't hit snooze. I jumped straight out of bed and into the bathroom and checked my whole body. I was just so relieved I was whole. I stared at my bare chest, stroked the area where the axe had hit me. I remembered feeling the pain, hearing the noises, seeing Jonathan's head roll. But I thought it was all some strangely realistic nightmare. And then I heard the crashing sound again. It sounded like a door being kicked in. Archer ran downstairs to see his terrified family, his mother and father, his sister Eleanor and his brother Jonathan, running to the back of the room. When he was down the stairs, he saw the men dressed in all black, saw how they broke through the door and ran inside. He tried to run, but the heavy axe was faster, cutting through his spine and throwing him toward the floor. I didn't even scream. I was too shocked to scream. And they just pulled the axe back out and ran towards my family. I can never forget the way Eleanor screamed, or how the axe cut through my mom's arm and chest. I didn't see how my dad died, but I saw his body on the floor, the blood slowly running out. I saw them rape Eleanor. That's the last thing I remember, how she screamed and begged them to stop. Archer had started to pull on the string in his left arm. I quickly stopped him. So, you are telling me you had another nightmare? Archer shook his head. Number, I'm saying I died a second time. And again I woke up in my bed. I raised my eyebrows, but Archer seemed not to see it. Or maybe he didn't care. The third time I woke up, I couldn't even stop myself. I checked my arms and legs, breathed for a moment, and then I ran downstairs. Eleanor and Jonathan and my mom were sitting there, and I nearly cried. And my dad came from the kitchen and made some snappy remark on the lines of, "Oh, awake so early." But I didn't even hear that. I just hugged him. I just needed to hug him. And then I ran to the kitchen and grabbed 2 knives. And I ran back in the living room. Archer laughed for a moment. My family thought I had gone nuts. But I wasn't nuts. I just saw and felt them die. Not just once, but twice. They tried to talk me into putting the knives down. But I refused. And just when my dad was getting worried, and then angry, in that very moment I heard the sound again, louder than before. Someone thrashing against the door. He grinned. I think my dad understood right away that something was up. He grabbed a bread knife from the table and stood next to me, and my mom ran to the phone. But by the time she had dialed, they were already inside, running towards us. I tried to stab the first one that came in, but he kicked me in the stomach, and when I fell to the floor, he jumped on me. I saw black, and the only thing I heard were screams and axes crashing against tables and walls and bodies. And then it got silent. There were footsteps, coming closer towards me, and heavy breathing. I tried to move away, but I couldn't move my body. And then he kneeled on my leg, and he picked something up from the side. Somebody else stood on one of my arms, and I howled from the pain. But I only realized what he had picked up when the knife pushed through my stomach. Archer's hands were shaking and his eyes tearing up. They made a cut. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it slicing through my stomach. I tried to kick the guy away, and I hit him, but he didn't budge. Instead, something hammered right into my leg. I screamed from the pain, but straight away this tickling started in my abdomen. Then it started to feel hot, and then incredibly painful. I choked up when I realized that he was pulling out my intestine. Then it got stuck somehow, and he got up from my leg. He made a step, and I could feel the sudden pull and the pain of something being ripped, and then I must have died. And the only reason I say I must have died is because I heard my alarm again. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. I just don't understand. I don't understand what it was. But after the 5th or 6th time, I was sure that it wasn't just my imagination. This was all too real and too painful, and no matter what rationalization I tried, it was just too long for a dream. The 6th or 7th night, after I saw my mom getting raped, I just tried to stay in bed. I unplugged my alarm and stayed in bed, hoping that it would all just end. And I think it took a bit longer. It really seemed to take longer for them to come. But then I heard the thrashing and screaming. The screams of my mom and sister stopped abruptly, but my dad kept screaming. I heard him begging them to stop. He even called my name. Archer bit his lips. Then there were steps on the stairs, and I tried to run into my wardrobe, but 2 of them came in, and even as I kicked, they grabbed me and threw me back on the bed. Another 2 came and threw my dad inside the room, on the floor. He was bleeding all across his face and back. And then they ripped his pants off. And they raped him too. Right in front of me, they raped him too. And I was too terrified to move. I just sat there, watching as my dad screamed for help and begged for them to stop. But they kept at it, one after the other opening their pants. And Archer choked on his own words. And they all did it. And the others were always staring at me. It was as if they enjoyed the fear and pain I felt. Finally, I don't even know if it was the third or the fourth one. Finally, I jumped up and tried to attack the guy that was violating my dad, but instead they kicked me down, and they held my head down to the floor, and they made me watch as they hacked off my dad's arm, and then part of his back, and then his head. They even kept chopping his body long after he stopped moving. And, Archer gagged, then they fed me a piece. They forced it into my mouth and I couldn't move. Then I started to suffocate and coughed, and suddenly it was gone. I ate a piece of my dad. They just laughed. They laughed, and even as I was lying there, sobbing, I remembered that the worst of it all was the way they laughed. It was so normal. Like laughter you normally hear on the street, or in the elevator, or at a party. They laughed as if someone had told a good joke, and then the axe hit my face. When I woke up, I tried to run away. I just jumped out of the window. I think I even sprained my ankle and ran, but they got me within seconds. They hacked off my arms, and then, after they broke the door, they threw me inside. I'll never forget that look in my mom's eyes when she saw me. And then I heard Jonathan and Eleanor and Mom and Dad scream. Then the scream stopped, and one of them stepped in front of me. He was holding my mom's hair, and her head was dangling down from it. And he started beating me with my mom's head. He smashed it against my chest and my crotch, and I was nearly happy when he finally started to beat it against my head when I knew that I would die. The next time I woke up, I just cried. Then I heard the noise downstairs, and I just walked down, right into one of their swinging axes, and I nearly enjoyed the pain, because I knew at least it would be quick. But then I woke up again. Archer slowly shook his head. I tried everything. I tried running out, calling the police, shouting for the neighbors, building weapons. Hell, I even tried squirting shampoo in their eyes and pouring soapy water on the floor. But every time my family was there again, downstairs, eating breakfast, and they didn't know what would come, but I did. After a while it hurt even more to see their faces, to see them alive, because I always started to guess which one they would torture the most, how they would torture me the most. And they always found a way. They always did something new. His voice got weaker. You know, the more smart I tried to be, and the more things I tried, the more horrible things they made me watch. They made my mom and my dad eat Jonathan and Eleanor. They chopped Jonathan's arms off and then pushed his body inside my mom's vagina until she stopped moving. And every time, when they saw that I was even more horrified than before, then they would laugh this weird, this normal laugh. He slowly traced the stitches on his right arm with his left hand, right from the wrist to the shoulder. That's why I did it. I went through this for what felt like months. They killed my family hundreds of times, and at some point I just lost hope. I figured, why fight it? And rather, I took the only sharp thing I had in my room, my old children's scissors, and ran them through my arms. After all that pain, I barely even felt it. And then I passed out, and I woke up here, with my family around me. He smiled. Finally, I understood his happiness. The way he smiled much of the time, he talked about his family being murdered horrifically. He was happy that it was over. He was happy that the men hadn't come. He was happy that his family found him in his bed. He was happy that, against all odds, he had survived. Abruptly, the smile disappeared from his face. You know, he looked at me, there is one thing I'm really worried about. Maybe you know the answer. I nodded to show that I was listening. The thing is, I'm worried because I haven't died, you know. It's been a week since I woke up, and these men didn't come anymore. But they always came after I died. He paused, and I nodded again. You know, someday when I die through a car accident or from old age or something, do you think I will wake up in my bed? In the darkness of the fields, I apologize for the length of this account. I have tried to preserve the sense of my memory as well as the factual details as sparingly as possible without destroying their effect. Rather than segment this story into separate posts, I have marked it into 3 parts, with page breaks for your ease in reading it, if you want to read one part and revisit the rest later. In editing, I've gone through and omitted from this story all the names of localities for the sake of not embarrassing small communities by reassociating them with painful events from their past. To give you some sense of the geography where they occurred, the events described below took place in a rural community between Lima, Ohio and Fort Wayne, Indiana. Growing up as I did in a cozy college town in central Ohio, my childhood visits to my grandmother's home in the country were always a mixed blessing for me. She lived in a small 1-story home along a country road nestled amongst the farms of western Ohio. While I loved visiting my grandmother, the openness of the country and its seemingly endless fields had a way of making me feel isolated, especially in the autumn months. During the summer, the tall, fern-green stalks of corn and the steamy soil gave the area an inviting vibrancy that helped fill this emptiness. The fall was much bleaker. Once the crops were harvested and the leaves had fallen off of the trees, the region took on an air of rot, that the remnants of the harvested stalks would dry and fade to the point where they finally resembled bleached bones did little to dispel this. One October, I headed up with my mom and dad for a visit. Of course, as someone who's always had an overactive imagination, the fact that the trip to her house was intermittently dotted abandoned cemeteries did nothing to help my uneasiness. Apparently family plots, they would consist of a handful of sandstone grave markers eroding like wet sugar cubes into tangled grass. There was also the occasional ruined church amongst the stones. Unfortunately for me, besides these sightings and the unending farmland, there wasn't much to break up the drive. Reading in the car has always made me sick. Naturally, I was relieved when I felt the tires shift onto the rumbling gravel that covered my grandma's driveway. After stretching my legs from the trip, I walked over to give my grandmother, a short, blue-haired woman of about 70 at the time, a hug. We followed her into the house for dinner. My grandmother was an amazing cook, and I always made sure my mom got her recipes. That Wutui generation really knew how to throw a stick of butter into mashed potatoes in a way that would blow your mind. There wasn't much to do at her house after dinner, so I volunteered to burn her trash. Now solidly in my tweens, I could be trusted with such responsibilities and took full advantage, since, like most boys that age, I fancied myself a bit of a pyro expert. As I dragged the bag of garbage out of the house, I noticed that it was already getting dark, and grey flannel clouds had silently filled the sky. Having visited the area enough to know that rain was probably coming soon, I hurriedly dragged the bag to the metal drum my grandma used for burning trash and lawn waste. It was at the back corner of the lot, where the edges of her grass, faded and gloomy with the fall, met the ragged dirt of the fields. I threw the bag in and lit it in a few places. I watched it for a while before the rain began to come down sprinkling. Deciding that the rain would be enough to keep the fire from spreading out of control, I went inside to the sound of rumbling thunder in the distance. Knowing that it was getting late, I began to get anxious with the thought of going to bed. I never slept well at my grandma's. As I said, I had an active imagination, and even in my secure suburban bedroom on the 2nd floor of our home, I frequently had nightmares about what could be outside my home while I was in bed. My grandmother's entire home was a single story. What was worse was that I usually slept in the breezeway, which I later discerned wasn't strictly a breezeway, but was more of a living room space between the garage and the house. It was separated from the house where my parents and grandmother stepped by a short flight of stairs and a door. There were 3 other doors, leading to the garage and front and back lawns. The room also had windows on every side except where it bordered the garage. Other than the couch I slept on and a sink, there was nothing else in the room. I always felt very alone and isolated sleeping in there. I laid in bed for a couple of hours and listened to it rain outside. After a while, I heard a train rumble by on the track across the street from the front lawn. I got off the couch and walked over to the window to watch it go by. It always made me uncomfortable how flimsy those single-pane windows were, like there was nothing separating you from the night. After the last car disappeared, I stood there looking out the window for a bit. At this point, it dawned on me that the rain had stopped. I was somewhat upset with myself, since I had missed my best chance of having that soothing sound lull me to sleep. However, I could still hear the rumbles and flashes of a storm, and hoped that it was another one moving in, and not just the last one growing more distant. As my eyes continued to adjust, I noticed a flicker on the grass in the right side of my vision. Clearly, the fire hadn't gone out in the back of the lawn, and I went to the rear breezeway window to check on it. Looking through the back window, it quickly became apparent that there had been more unburnt refuse in the drum than I had thought, and the glow of the fire was casting spots of faint orange light along the lawn and fields. The light was reaching far into the night in that flat, dark country, and I noted with some dismay that the storm appeared to be moving south. As I watched the faint flashes of lighting exploding on the horizon, my eyes shifted back to the fields behind my grandmother's house. There was something moving on the edge of the light. My eyes were fairly well adjusted to the night at this point, and I gradually made it out. It was the form of a woman dancing in the field. Her movements weren't frantic. They were closer to the way a ballerina moves, slowly dipping the torso, lifting the leg gracefully, bowing the arms over her head, and so on. I stood there, petrified in silence. Her mere presence and peculiar movement would have been enough to frighten me. However, a distant flash of lighting consumed the entire field in a moment of pale white light, revealing that she was also completely naked. My hands gripped the windowsill. She slowly danced along the edges of the fire's orange light, never stepping more than a foot or an arm directly into it. It made me even more uncomfortable when I noticed that she was facing the house and appeared to be closer than she was when I first saw her. There had only been the one lightning flash to illuminate the entire field, so it was difficult to tell at first. But as she drew nearer to the window from which I was watching, I began to realize that her skin was incredibly wrinkled. Despite the grace and effortlessness of her movements, her skin appeared to be ancient as it sagged off of her limbs. Gradually, she quit edging around the borders of the light and reversed her dance movements back into the darkness. I pulled myself away from the window and buried my face in the couch. I spent the rest of the night trying to convince myself that it was a trick of shadows. I didn't get a wink of sleep that night, and crashed around 6 or 7 a.m. when the sun came up. Even though I hadn't called for them the night before, my family knew how hard it was for me to sleep at my grandmother's and let me sleep in for a while. I was eventually woken up by my father, who informed me that my grandma's ladder was broken and we would need to go borrow one from my Uncle Harley, who was actually my great-uncle, though I never referred to him as such. I smiled and rolled off the couch. I always enjoyed seeing my Uncle Harley, and was quick to get ready to go, despite my lack of sleep. I recall being quiet on the ride over to Harley's farm. Looking out onto the fields, I realized even if footprints had been left by the woman in the wet dirt, they would be nearly impossible to find in such a large field with so much debris left over from the harvest. Undecided as to whether that made me feel better or worse, I continued to watch the ruins of the cornstalks fly by along the roadside until the buildings of my uncle's farm began to come into view. My Uncle Harley was a pig farmer, and to this day, it makes me smile when people invoke the profession derisively. My uncle was a successful businessman and farmer, owning a large factory-style farm. Though he didn't do any of the processing on site, he did own several large feed silos next to the long metal barns, which held the pig pens. My uncle was a self-made man, and veteran of both World War II and Korea, and reminded me a bit of Clint Eastwood. The man was tall and powerful, even in his advanced age, and despite his stoic demeanor, he had surprisingly sharp sense of humor. I could see him waving to us as we turned into his driveway. As I got out of the car, I noticed how strong the stench of the pigs was. It was a smell I was used to, and the surrounding area fairly permeated of it, along with the other scents that colored the air in farm country. I actually grew to be somewhat fond of the smell from a distance, as weird as that sounds, but it was overpowering up close. I flashed my uncle a smile but covered my nose with my shirt as soon as he and my dad turned away from me towards the work shed, where my uncle kept his ladders. I went over to a tire swing, hanging from a tree on the opposite side of his house, and, more importantly, upwind of the barns. When my uncle came back around the house with my dad carrying the ladder under one arm, I was standing on the swing, with one foot in the tire, and my hands grasping the rope connecting it to the tree. "You keep swinging around like that, you're just going to stir up the smell," he yelled to me as I hopped off the swing. I was mildly embarrassed that he had keyed in on my distaste for the smell, but felt better when he conceded that the rain had made it worse than usual. We stayed a bit after picking up the ladder, but my dad wanted to get back to my grandma's before dark. We were only going to be there for the weekend, and he wanted to make sure we finished the work. When we got back, my dad had me hold the ladder as he scooped brown muck out of the gutter. I was so lost in thought, looking out into the fields, that I nearly dropped the ladder. After a piece of the muck falling, shocked me back to reality. I was only able to offer a feeble apology afterward, as my mind was still on the previous night, and the faded orange on the horizon that indicated that night was coming. Not wanting to give my parents a reason to doubt my maturity or sanity, I didn't tell them about the night before. The reward for my bravery was another night in the breezeway. Unlike the night before, this one was completely cloudless, with a bright moon casting pale rays through the windows. I didn't figure I was in for much sleep, and just laid on my back in the couch, staring at the ceiling. I could hardly believe it when I heard the grandfather clock's Westminster chimes from across the house, followed by the bells denoting the hour. How clearly those low tones made their way through the air made me realize how silent the night had been, and let me know that it was already 2 a.m. The drowsy formation of this thought was shattered by another sound, a faint sound, rustling from outside. The noise sent a chill down my spine, and I immediately snapped up to see that the window over the sink was cracked open. My mom or grandma must have opened it for ventilation during the day. Doing my best not to look out the window and to stay beneath the window line above which someone could see me, I rolled off the couch and hugged closely the sink. As my fingers crept up the wall, over the sill, and onto the window, I heard another rustle, louder, from the backyard. Out of my peripheral vision, I saw movement, and felt a tear of frustration and fear trace down my cheek. I pulled the window shut, and as I did so, looked out the window to my left into the backyard. The woman was there, standing not 15 feet from the house and staring at me through the window. I was frozen, partly out of fear, and partly out of a hope she didn't see me. After all, I was closing a window on nearly the opposite side of the room in the dead of night. Her body was facing away from me, and the skin on her back was hanging like melted wax. Her head was turned, looking over her left shoulder to face the house, to face me. Her arms were spread out at away from her body, and her palms were aimed in my direction. With the same grace that she had displayed the night before, she pivoted her body on one foot, turning to face the rear window. She slowly moved towards the house. Her movements illuminated the moonlight. It was then that I realized yet another horrible thing about this woman. Her skin wasn't just baggy, it was jointed. She looked like a rag doll that had been sewn together. It seemed like it was being held together from shedding in sections. The moon cast shadows over eye sockets, which didn't quiet, seem to fit her face. As she crept closer, I noticed her lips looked thin and cracked, and her breasts were dry and shriveled. Slowly she placed her hands on the frame of the window, and I made out the glint of two eyes in the shadows of those ill-shaped sockets. They were peering right at me, with an intensity that cut right through the space between us. The shock of her looking into the house was enough to turn the squeaks caught in my throat into screams. I flopped onto the floor and scrambled backwards against the front door. I could hear my parents stirring in the house, and as their footsteps approached, the woman tilted her head back. Her face appeared to stretch into a howl, but it didn't seem like she could move her lips very far apart. I couldn't hear if she made a sound. She pirouetted and disappeared back into the night. I threw up into my lap as my parents came into the room. The next morning, my parents didn't prod me to talk about what I had seen. I explained it to them in jabbering fashion the night before as they helped me clean up. Eventually, I fell asleep with my mom sitting up next to me. I had had a handful of night terrors when I was younger, and my parents chalked up my experience to that category. I said nothing to dispute this. Even though I didn't believe it, I hoped that I really had had a night terror, and that maybe that would explain what I had seen. My dad offered to let me stay at my grandmother's, as he returned the ladder he had borrowed from my uncle. Because I didn't want my family to worry about my state, I insisted on accompanying him. Besides, I figured getting out would help calm me down. However, as we drove, I imagined her behind every tree we passed, lurking in every drainage ditch. For the most part, I just laid back with my seat reclined, staring into nothing until we got to the farm. By the time we got there, I was feeling a bit better. Still, I decided to stay in the car, as my dad went with my uncle to return the ladder to its shed. I didn't need the smell of those pigs upsetting my stomach further. As I was trying to put my thoughts elsewhere, I glanced into the rearview mirror and saw another vehicle coming down the driveway. It was a pickup. It pulled past me towards the barn. As my uncle and dad came around the house, the truck stopped and the driver got out. I was relieved that my uncle didn't appear concerned, but he did have a stern look on his face. He made a couple of steps towards the pickup and pointed the driver to the barn. The driver then walked over the barn, slid the door to the side, and picked up the leash to a pig that had been tied to one of the pens. As he led the pig towards the pickup, my uncle and father kept walking towards the car. I opened the door to say hi. "That's Teddy," my uncle said. "He has a small farm, maybe a dozen pigs. Usually don't sell single hogs and sows. Started doing it a while ago to help him get started, and now it seems like he's coming by once every few weeks." "What's his problem?" my dad asked. My uncle laughed. "With the pigs or with everything else?" "Not sure, in any case. He eats some, tries to breed others, I suppose. I don't talk with him much, just sell him a pig every now and then. He says he butchers his own meat." My dad looked over in the man's direction. Is he trying to be self-sufficient? I guess. I try not to talk to him too much. God damn it, Ted. I looked away from my uncle and dad to see the man opening the hog's throat with a long knife. He had his arm around its side, as its legs kicked around like it was being electrocuted. I couldn't believe how much blood spilled out of its neck and onto the ground. "Didn't I tell you not to do that here?" The man smiled weirdly at my uncle, and then slung the pig's limp body into the bed of the truck. It was amazing how effortlessly he did it. The hog must have weighed a few 100 pounds. He pulled a tarp over the body before he closed the tailgate. The man turned and got into the driver's side of the car. Blood was dripping onto the ground from under the tailgate. My uncle sighed and looked at the ground, visibly pissed. He doesn't have a proper trailer to move them around, so sometimes he does that here to make it easier. Smiling up at me, he added, or sometimes he hog-ties them." I laughed, even though it wasn't a great joke, or even a joke at all, really, since I'm sure that's exactly what he did. The way my uncle said it put a smile on my face. He pinched the bridge of his nose as the pickup drove by, and waved with his other hand without looking at the man. The man barely looked at us, but I caught a glimpse of his eyes that made me shiver. We left for home fairly soon, after getting back to my grandmother's, which was fine with me. I loved her, but I was ready to get out of there. I slept the whole ride home, and tried to put the whole experience out of mind as best as I could. For years after that, I visited my grandma's without incident. On one particular visit, I picked up the local paper while I was in town. On the front page was the face of the man I had seen at the farm that day, Teddy. The memory of that story and the realization that came with it chills me even now as I recollect it. The man, who was apparently named Teddy Warden, had been in a car accident in his pickup. He was speeding through a stop sign on a country road in the early morning when a semi crushed in the passenger side of his truck. The pickup was sent spinning across the intersection and flipped into a drainage ditch. By the time the driver of the semi got out to check on the other vehicle, Warden had already crawled out of the cab and was tearing across the field. Perplexed, the driver continued towards the flipped pickup, then fled back to his semi to call for help. The tarp was draped out of the bed of the pickup, fully uncovering its spilled contents. Corpses, and the parts of corpses were scattered into the mud. Later that day, the sheriff's office, with backup from a larger, nearby city's police department, showed up at the man's house. They reported an overpowering stench from outside the building. Opening the garage, they found the butchered and rotting skeletons of hogs. One hog was hanging upside down, field dressed like a deer. They noted that it appeared as if he was slaughtering them and feeding them to the other pigs, as putrefying hog meat was found in the feed troughs. It was a matter they were forced to investigate in some detail after the horror they discovered inside. The officers were met by an intensified smell inside the house. The building was completely unlit, and I can only imagine how horrible it was for them to comb that house. The source of the smell wasn't the pigs, or at least wasn't just the pigs. Hanging from the walls were remnants of human bodies in various stages of decomposition. They weren't just hung on the wall as trophies either. The paper likely spared many of the details, but noted that there were several overturned skulls that appeared to be used as bowls. When the officers entered Warden's room, they found him rocking in his bed, hands at his side. He had skulls on the bedposts. The floor was apparently littered with the remains of corpses, and even though he made no reported attempt to resist arrest, it was apparently difficult to get Warden out through the darkness and clutter. Warden only howled as they removed him from the house. The writer noted that his home's distance from the road, and Warden's known habit of transporting butchered animals in his truck, had kept the signs of his activities hidden. As of the date of that paper's printing, those involved had discerned that the body parts had come from at least 38 separate individuals, though they were still in the process of sorting and identifying the remains. Initially, this confused investigators. Such a high number of disappearances would have been noticed in such a small town. However, the answers to their questions quickly became apparent through examination of the corpses and interviews with Warden. Many of the bodies were ancient, nearly fully decomposed. The investigators surmised that they had been stolen from graves, a conclusion that was later confirmed by Warden. While a few were identified as thefts from more recent burials, the majority of the bodies had been stolen from the abandoned cemeteries that sit by the country roads, the disturbed earth obscured by the long grass. They will likely never discover the identities of many of these older corpses. Though the thought of Warden quietly absconding in the dead of night to an abandoned graveyard and stealing the long decomposing bodies interred therein is certainly chilling to me, The most unsettling part of the story involves how they found Warden in his house before they arrested him. When the officers discovered Warden in his bed, he was lying next to a woman's suit, carefully sewn together from the skin of the fresher corpses he had exhumed. Through interviews, the police had discovered that Warden would wear the suit and prowl the fields at night, using the seclusion afforded by the darkness and remoteness to live out his fantasy. The realization washed over me. All those years ago I had seen him. He and I, alone in the darkness, separated by a flimsy window and a little bit of space,